there wasn't just an anxiety of like, oh no, would I become my mother or would I become my father? There was also an anxiety about, well, what if I overcorrect? What if I had parents who were quite neglectful, but then I am a total helicopter parent? There was also an anxiety of like, what if I overcorrect for this?
Hello and welcome to Separate Bathrooms, a podcast about relationships.
And life, I think.
And all sorts of good stuff in between.
Sometimes we get authors on talking about books. Sometimes we get couples that have been through certain situations. Sometimes it's just me and Elle.
That's right.
And we have a yak about what's going on in our life.
We have a very special guest today. Her name is Gina Rushton. She's an editor, reporter, and author. She's worked as a journalist for 9 years, and her first book, The Most Important Job in the World, is a work of non-fiction, and it's available now.
When Gina admitted she had little time left to make the decision for herself to have a child, the magnitude of the choice overwhelmed her. Her search for her own yes or no only uncovered more questions to be answered. We have some questions for Gina Rushton today.
We do indeed. We're excited to talk to her. So let's have Gina enter our bathroom.
Welcome, Gina Rushton, to the bathroom. How are you going today?
Good.
Are you busy?
Yeah, a bit.
Tell us where you are, because you had mentioned that you're doing something pretty special.
Yeah, I'm just in Melbourne doing some publicity stuff for the book. So kind of the last little leg of it, I guess, which is, good.
Fantastic. And you're in the bathroom with us to actually talk about your book, The Most Important Job in the World. Tell us why this book and why you writing this book.
Yeah, so the book is about the decision of whether or not to have a kid, basically. And I guess why me? I mean, didn't have to be me. But I guess it sort of came about because my background as a journalist is writing about reproductive rights and healthcare. And so there was a lot around that I wanted to put in the book about how we think about parenthood. I had a kind of I guess a medical emergency that was the real impetus for the book.
Okay.
That you had yourself?
Yeah.
Right. So was that like a bit of a wake-up call for you?
Yeah, I think so. Like I'd always decided that I really didn't want kids. And then I found myself being told that they were going to have to go in and do emergency surgery and cut one of my ovaries out, which in the end didn't happen. But they just drained a lot of blood out of my pelvis and told me I had endometriosis. But I was really shocked that before going into the surgery, found myself quite upset, and I sort of realised that probably the decision wasn't as set in stone for me as I thought it was.
Let's get back to the beginning. What was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up, so I'm one of four. I'm the youngest. My parents separated when I was really young, so my mum's sort of the primary care was my primary caregiver, which I'm sure, has influenced how I think about motherhood and the labour involved.
Yeah.
Did that inform your childhood and what you went through? Did that inform, so do you feel like it informed where you've ended up with this point of view today and why you wrote the book?
Yeah, I do. Like I didn't think, I guess I wanted to, and this is not to, patronise my mum or whatever, but I did want a really different life to her. Like she had her first kid when she was 18, and I think that I was really set on, I guess motherhood was never posed as particularly appealing for me. And I don't mean that, she doesn't love her children and it hasn't been fulfilled by that. But I think that mixed with, I guess, like the generation of feminism I grew up on as well, which was very anti-maternal, I think probably together helped impact or push me away from motherhood.
Everyone, a lot of women read what to expect when you're expecting, when you're sort of going into pregnancy and whatnot. Would you like your book to be a book that women read before they even get pregnant or before they even get into a partnership? Would you think that would be something that would be really helpful for women?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically a debate about all the questions we ask when we ask, do we want kids or do we not want kids? So there's some really big existential things around, climate change and the nature of work, and then like gendered roles in relationships and how we think about our family histories. I think for me, like the thing that I would love, even just from the outset with the book is, for many people, they just always know they want children, or they always know that they don't want children. And it's a really simple question. But I think for people who it's not a simple question, I kind of wanted to validate that, to kind of say, like, it's okay if this is a fraught question for you and you don't really hear the yes or the no really loudly, because I definitely didn't. That notion that it's like it can be really complicated for some people. Absolutely.
And I feel like that the generation, are you 29? Or?
I'm about to turn 30, yeah.
About to turn 30, yeah.
Woo-hoo.
And I feel like that your generation now, we've got a 26-year-old, and sort of I kind of put you in the same generation. It is a much bigger question than, say, my mother's generation, where it was just a given. That's what you did, and at that point, I think even at her workplace, once you were pregnant, you actually weren't allowed to work anymore, which was really interesting. So we've got, this generation of incredibly smart, amazing, powerful, career-driven women who are, it's so exciting to see that. Our niece, Lucy, she's got all of the girls around her, or women around her, are all like this incredibly independent, strong women. And yet they also want to have children, and knowing what that's going to mean for their career. Yeah. So it is such a big question, and I think it's great that you've written a book for that generation, or for those women, whether they be younger or older, to consider what that's going to mean for them in their lives.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, I think for decades, people have always been really aware that having a kid is going to, interrupt your career trajectory, even if temporarily with mat leave or whatever. But we know, obviously, that it has impacts for longer. But I think it's sort of the first generation where work has become kind of a central place of meaning making. So it's not just, leaving the workplace for a bit. It's like leaving this place where you've tied your identity to it as well.
Okay.
Right.
Like, I think that's a very sort of millennial thing of like, do what you love, and like your work and all the things you used to hold dear outside of work have kind of just been embedded into it. So I think for a lot of people, it feels like this even bigger equation of I'm so tied up with my job as well. So parenthood becomes this like other thing that's competing with that, I guess.
So are you saying that this generation that you're writing for identifies themselves through their work? Like if
Yeah, and I should say, like, I actually don't think that's a particularly good thing.
I don't think so either. Yeah, I don't think so either.
Yeah, I think that it's, having worked somewhere, like in media, where companies really benefit from you pouring everything into your job, and they're not, without the working conditions that generations before us had, like, it's sort of like, well, you've got this perk, and like it's a family, and, we're a, like one of the jobs I worked at, it was like, we have a kombucha machine, and like, free lunch on avocado toast on Fridays or whatever. But ultimately, like, there were mass layoffs and I lost my job. Like, the stability isn't there. Like, the actual workplace conditions aren't as good as they were, and you have tied your entire identity up with this job. So when you lose it, like when I lost my job, I was like, who am I?
Right.
Which isn't healthy, I don't think. And that's not to say like the answer is going and having heaps of kids, because like that's a better way to find meaning. I think it's just more, someone's profiting off one of those options.
And why is this happening? Why are millennials so identified in their job? Did that come up in your research?
So I think like part of it is just that there's been a shift away from, this is so boring, but it's kind of an industrial relations thing where there's a shift away from like meaning in your job has become like, instead of being like complementary to the job, it's almost like supplementary to good working conditions and stuff. So people will say like, yeah, the wage is this, but like, we have team building things, or we have a ping pong table, or whatever the thing is. But I also think it's kind of like, as I was saying before, like that brand of feminism. Like, I got my first full-time job when Lean In came out, that kind of feminism that's all about like a lot of the women I know, like they very much were raised on that sort of feminism that was really anti-maternal and really anti-motherhood and really like, you will find your freedom and liberation in the workplace. Like that's going to be the place.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it's like, I mean, you know, I think that's maybe has been true for some people, but I think a lot of people are now kind of questioning that a bit more.
As they should.
Yeah.
I mean, you've mentioned something before about you didn't know who you were or after you lost your job. I mean, that's a really good question to ask yourself.
Totally.
You know, am I my job or am I what I do or who am I?
Yeah,
You know?
and it's like we don't value, like I don't value other people and their jobs. Like I value my friends because they're kind or funny, but you know, when it comes to ourselves, you sort of like am I my labor?
And as you sort of, I'm sure, point out, you know, there's generations of women my age, you know, 52, who are now having the empty nest syndrome, who are going, who am I without mothering my children?
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
we're so strongly identified as being, and of course you're always a mother, but it when that career changes, it's very, very, I found it incredibly challenging. So yeah, it's a really interesting point you're making.
Gina, through your work, through your research, how do you think we can get back to the core of who we are? Like if the outside part of us, the part that we present to the world is ego and this idea of the things that we do that identify us. Whereas I know for myself, and there's a lot of people walking around going, I am so much more than what you see. My core of who I intrinsically am, that little kid, you know, that played in the playground at age 5, that's still burning inside me. How do we get back to that, do you think?
God, what a good question. I wish I knew. I do think it's kind of about shedding. Like I do think for me, getting back to who I am is often tied up with trying to value myself how I value other people, or trying to bring out the parts that I want to bring out in other people, in myself, whether that's being, you know, as kind and compassionate to yourself as you would be with others. But I mean, if you ever find out the answer.
I'm on a mission. I'm on a bit of a mission for myself, actually. But I'm curious about it because given what you're talking about in the book, I mean, can I reread this one section that we wanted to ask you? The book is about the decision of whether to have a child. So it really is a book about everything we love and fear in ourselves, in each other, and in the world as it is, as it will be. It's about love, labour, hope, fear, legacy, gender, and I love this, ambient dread. Can you explain more then of what you mean by everything we love and fear in ourselves, in especially in relation to what you're talking about, having a child?
Yeah, I mean, I think having a child, I mean, the thing about considering parenthood is it throws you into a time beyond yourself. So, I mean, that brings up all sorts of things on the ambient dread front, whether it's about climate change or, you know, what the world will be like in years to come. And I think in terms of the questions it raises about yourself, I mean, the stakes become higher when you're thinking about creating another person and being responsible for that person. And I think that like it's the things that you start to evaluate yourself even when you're considering parenthood, and like what are my weaknesses and what are my strengths, I guess, as a person, and how would that impact another person? And I think the funny thing about it is it actually wasn't in my book proposal. It wasn't something that I was going to put in the book, but I did so many interviews and it came up so many times with people where people had really big anxieties about how they thought the way their childhoods and the way they were parented and the people that they were, how that would impact if they had kids and how they would parent, and whether that was like trauma and how they thought that would play out when they became parents, or like positive things about, you know, I had a really strong relationship with this parent and I'm interested to see if that will like play out, you know, in my kids. But yeah, there those anxieties about what lives on beyond us and what have we not resolved from our past as well. Like they were just questions that came up all the time in interviews.
Yeah, right.
mean, I think it is a good question to ask yourself too. I mean, you can either, it's fascinating when when there's a family, and there's perhaps the parents are alcoholics and you've got 3 children and one child follows into alcoholism and another child follows into life of sobriety and being an alcoholic counselor, or an alcohol counselor. It's interesting how it can divide a family individually, how a child is raised. So I guess it ends up being the individual's choice, of course, not always, because sometimes those things slip by you before you realize that you're parenting the way that your mum and dad parent. You wish you weren't, but
it's so in us that you go, I'll never do what my mother did or father did in that situation, and then here you are, you find yourself with a screaming 3-year-old and you're doing exactly the same thing because it's so innate, or it's so in you.
Yeah.
You have to really work hard to be conscious and go, no, this is the present and this is the way I want to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think that it was interesting, there wasn't just an anxiety of oh no, would I become my mother or would I become my father? There was also an anxiety about, well, what if I overcorrect?
Yes.
What if I had parents who were quite neglectful, but then I am a total way too involved helicopter parent.
Yeah.
Exactly. There was also an anxiety of what if I overcorrect for this?
That's a really good overcorrection. I think is a really good point you make, because we tend to. I'll make a golf analogy. A coach gives you this thing and goes, just make this adjustment, and you go and you make it huge, and suddenly the ball's not going right anymore; it's going way left, and he's like, no, it's just a slight. Just a flavor. Just even think about what I'm asking you to correct, and it'll be a slight adjustment.
Yeah.
And also with our parents too, I love what my mum and dad did with me. Yeah, I mean, they had no handbook either. They were doing their thing. But that I do know that they were doing the best they could possibly do every single time. Every time. And I feel like that's something with us as a parent, honey, that we've done the very best we could do every single time. And sure, we were dealing with our kids last weekend about talking about this big clunker mistake that we made. I'm sitting there going, oh shit, I was doing the best I could. I really did.
Yeah, but the standards, I mean, that's another thing that a lot of people had anxieties about not wanting to become parents. A lot of it was also I don't want to enter into a role in which I'm supposed to be perfect.
Yes.
What a job to take on, particularly in motherhood. We still hold ourselves to these archetypes that are just
absolutely,
you can't do anything but fail by those standards.
Absolutely. You will never live up to this idea of the perfect mother, down to whether or not we've made the right lunchbox, or whether excuse me, or whether we've, trained our kid to get A's, or there's so much, and I think there is a much more heavy emphasis on the mothering than anything. You write I don't know if it's a whole chapter, but I know a lot of a through line through your book is about the generation's concern for climate change, and that's a reason not to have children, because we're adding to the footprint of the earth. How big a consideration is that for people these days?
So I was really surprised both by so I did about 40 interviews for the book, and I would say it came up, I think, in almost every single one. Climate change came up, even for the chapter that wasn't about climate change. But what was really interesting was that it had really shifted. I think even say 5 years ago, when my friends and I would talk about having kids or not having kids or whatever, the question was always well, I don't want to add another carbon footprint to the earth. And it was really wrapped up in guilt and personal responsibility. And I actually think that has really shifted into an anger that's more where I think it should be, which is on governments and corporations, which is very much well, hang on, why would I, shrink my desires for my family or the size of my family before people with a lot more power to enact change in this space, before they, why would I not have kids before we transform our energy systems or make policy changes. And I think that that's been the real shift, is that the people who were previously walking around feeling really guilty are just now angry and realizing like, well, so I don't have kids, but you're still going to build a coal mine.
Yeah.
And I think that's been the shift. And that was really interesting. Like people, the term carbon footprint, like that was popularized by a resources company. It was an attempt to make people feel individually responsible for what, corporations were doing. So I think that's been a big shift in that debate, which I found really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Here's the $64,000 question, Gina.
Oh, gosh.
What's your decision about having a baby?
You got to read the book.
Well said.
I haven't read the book.
No, honestly, I think it's still a live question for me. But I do think that what I did realize was like I really marched into this question thinking that my reasons were very sort of rational. Like I thought, well, I don't want to have a kid because of climate change. Like I don't want to have a kid that's going to have to deal with natural disasters and whatever's to come. And I don't want to, and cost of living stuff and housing prices. Like I'm going to be about, how am I going to afford to rent in Sydney forever? Like all of these quite practical, rational decisions. And I think that what I ultimately found was that taking this journalistic approach where everything's kind of a pros and cons list, like it ended up for me, and the book kind of moves towards this, being quite an emotional and personal decision, which was very much really more about relationships and how I felt about myself as like quote unquote motherhood material than anything else.
Interesting. Are you in a relationship now?
I am, yeah.
Yeah. And is he daddy material or?
No, definitely. No, totally. Like he's from a very like big, close-knit family, like the kind of family that you would, if you grew up in that family, you would think, well, of course I'll have kids. Look at this amazing support network of people who really care about each other. So, yeah, I think for him it's kind of a different equation.
And of the 40 people that you interviewed, were they all women or did you interview men as well?
No, I interviewed a lot of men actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. So I interviewed sort of people from really different specialty. Like for the climate change chapter, I interviewed climate experts who had kids.
Yeah.
Which was really interesting because a few of them were men who were grappling with, having to map and work in like the most grim data you've ever seen every day, and still, and still had kids and still had hope and anger and political motivation and stuff. So, I interviewed men for many of the chapters, including there's a one that's about kind of about emotional labor and the division of care and communication in particularly heterosexual relationships. And I interviewed a lot of men for that, about masculinity and talking about feelings and things.
Based on all your research and working out whether you're going to have a child in the future with this ever-changing world, is there a criteria that you put, and are you factoring in that people do change and do evolve based on around circumstances and events that happen in their lives?
I mean, do you mean criteria for a partner who I'd have to give you the criteria?
Yeah, a checklist,
he's pretty great. And I think like it's interesting, like the final acknowledgement in the book is for him. And I think I said something like, thank you for letting me have this conversation with myself before I had it with you. Oh. And I kind of almost wanted, like a lot of the issues in the book we hadn't really even talked about, but I wanted to kind of like be like, okay, here's the book and here's how I've been thinking and feeling about a lot of these things, and here are all the things that I've learned, like in a funny way. Like we've got this amazing resource where I've already done all my thinking on the page about how I feel about all of these things. And I think it's kind of important, like what I'm hoping, and I'm already having these conversations with people who have read it, is like, I think that women also want their partners, particularly in heterosexual relationships, to understand the kind of motherhood they don't want, like the kind of relationship they don't want to be in, and the kind of, they don't want to enter into a motherhood in which they're expected to be just unrealistically like that old archetype of being like absolutely without needs, without any life beyond your kids, without temper, without um, I guess humanity, really, like her complexity, and being able to say, like, yeah, I don't want that anymore. I want to be in a partnership, and I want to be in a relationship where I can have a really expansive motherhood, I guess.
It's always good to focus on what you want. I always find that it's like riding a bike. If you're looking over the cliff, you'll end up driving over the cliff.
Yeah.
But if you're focusing on, I want to stay on the high side, you'll stay. You know, your eyes go where the bike goes where your eyes go. And I find that in really stating what you want, as opposed to what you don't want. It's good to acknowledge what you don't want, but maybe finish the thought of with, this is what I want.
Yeah, and like I should say, like another conversation we've been having is like, are millennials just like, it's also about control, and you lose so much control in parenthood because you just got to kind of hand yourself over to this to do another being, I guess. And I do think like there have been a few people who have said like, well, this is just kind of millennial neuroses. Like you don't want to enter into a thing where you lose all this control because you've lived a life in which you kind of, you can't control climate, and you can't, like, there's a feeling of like lawlessness or something that I think, maybe millennials aren't as good at handling.
Did this come up a lot in the book or in the research for you, that are women still grappling with the guilt of, I've spent so much time on my career and not enough time on my children, or I've spent so much time with my children and now my work is suffering? Is that something that you're hearing a lot of still from women?
Oh, absolutely. It's just like you can't win equation. And like there's just so much shame and judgment around every decision. Like you feel like a bad mum if you're spending too much time on your career and not enough time on your kids. Like there were people that said, well, I had kids in my late 20s. I don't know if you've seen that website Reductress, but there's this headline that's like, it's like, this woman had a baby at 27, teen mum. Like the idea of the idea of, like, I have friends in their late 20s having kids, and they're like, I feel like some kind of like bumpkin. Like I feel like some kind of like, a teen mum, which and I know that the age of having your first kids moving backwards, but the point that they're made to feel like, that they've somehow given up some kind of intellectual, or I don't know, there's just judgment at every point, no matter what. And whether that's self-judgment or what. I mean, that's the other thing is like when people were saying, oh, I don't want to enter into motherhood because it's kind of this thing where you also fail. You're also being monitored while you fail on social media and like.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really different equation now where,
So that is a consideration, just the judgment of social media and how that goes?
Yeah, I think so. Just feeling like, am I doing it right? And having access to like, just like, I mean, Instagram is just like, having access to these, being overwhelmed and fed through the algorithm. Like I just know mums, I know mums who've just had to delete Instagram because they're just fed like accounts of women who, are like back at the gym postpartum, like 2 weeks later, like all of that, just like, how am I the only one who's finding this hard, that kind of feeling? Like, I think it heightens that.
Were there challenges in researching this book? Did you hit any roadblocks?
No, like people really wanted to talk. Like I was really overwhelmed by people that wanted to talk, particularly about, the one chapter where I had way too many interviewees, and I thought it was really interesting that so many people wanted to talk, was definitely the fertility chapter. Like people, it made me realize, like even as a reproductive rights and healthcare journalist, that there's just not enough about infertility and pregnancy loss. And like I think that there were so many people that wanted to tell their story and felt like they hadn't read enough of that, which was really interesting. Because, of course, like, the first 7 chapters of the book are like, should I? And then it kind of gets to one chapter where I'm like, well, could I even? I've got endometriosis, and what does it look like if I go through this whole thing and then finally go, okay, I'm going to have kids, and then hit, face some of the experiences facing these women. Like, could I actually survive that? And am I willing to open myself up to that? And those are big questions.
Yeah, we interviewed a couple who started their own, I don't know if it's a charity, but the Infertility Australia.
Information site, really.
Yeah, information site, because that was exactly their experience. They, you expect you're going to be able to get pregnant pretty easily, and 7 years later, they've gone through. She's gone through multiple operations. She's gone through IVF, 5, 6, 7 times. And it was on the last shot that they went, oh, we're doing this one more time and that's it, that they actually did get pregnant. But it was a really interesting insight into that world.
Yeah, well, you don't see, when someone, once again, social media, but when someone posts their pregnancy announcement or their baby ultrasound or whatever, you don't see how many attempts there might have been before that, or, we're not that as good at, and there's actually a couple in the book who I remember I interviewed them and they had twins and they posted it. And I think I'm sort of probably overexposed to the things that can go wrong in a pregnancy just because of what I report on. So I'm probably too in one space about it. But I remember they posted that they were having twins at 8 weeks. And I remember my personal reaction being like, oh God, don't tell anyone, like my own. And in the caption they said we're posting this because if we do have a miscarriage, we want community around us and we want people to know and we want people to know. And I just thought, oh my God, I think there's something kind of wrong with the culture that we expect all this pain to be private.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to just be held by two people. I think that's really hard.
If you, wherever you go in your life and however you decide to baby, not baby or whatever, if you were to have a child, have you thought about what that would do or how you would handle your career and parenting? What would you do?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that one really healthy thing that's come through writing the book, and honestly has come through losing that job, is I don't over-identify with work anymore. And I've really lost that. I've really shed that. So I think for me, if I do become a parent, it won't feel like as big a sacrifice. I mean, I'm sure financially and all the other parts of it, but I definitely don't. I'm shedding that over-identification with work as an editor and as a journalist. And so I think that for me has made it a bit of an easier equation. But I really wanted, and I wish I'd spent more time on it in the book, just challenging the notion that it's either work or a career. I think it's just such an impoverished way of thinking of, what a life can be. And it's so unfair to people that don't have children by being like, well, the thing that you must have picked was a career, when it's well, what if you picked community or creativity or I don't know, volunteering or whatever the thing is. There's so much life beyond that kind of binary between being completely devoted to a family or completely devoted to a career, or God forbid, trying to balance being completely devoted to both.
Yeah.
As you're talking then, I'm just thinking, you were who you were before you started working.
Yeah, of course.
Right? And it's interesting how once we start working, we forget who we are and we suddenly become, I'm Joe Actor, or I'm, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it's a crock of shit, basically, because we were who we were before we started piling all this life on top of us, and ego and shitty things happening to us and all those sort of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of, I think ego is a good word. There is a lot of ego in it. And I think it's really healthy to remove that from it. Yeah.
We need to wind up, though. I have a last question. I'm sure Ali's got one too. After this project, are you feeling positive about the future?
That's a really good question. I still have the anxieties about climate and about work and about, various forms of collapse and stuff. But I think it was really a wake-up call for me, particularly interviewing the climate scientists who had kids, because I thought, we can't retreat into the horror. You can't sook when there's stuff to be done.
Yep.
And I don't mean it's up to individuals to change. I mean, I think that it was really helpful for me to kind of realize that there's no use in being paralyzed about anxiety about the future. And I think that that's not about not taking responsibility, but I think it's just it made me I interviewed so many amazing people in the book and so many amazing people that are going to be amazing parents. And I should say half the people who were supposedly ambivalent about kids have now had kids since the book bloody came out.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Like one of the couples who was most anxious about climate change pre-ordered the book from the Labour ward.
That's
So, but yeah, and to answer your question, I have a lot of hope, and faith.
I do have one more question.
I knew she would. She would.
With you've written so many amazing essays and pieces about women's reproductive rights, and now you've written this book. What change do you want to see in the world for women's reproductive rights?
Well, I think with reproductive rights in particular, I mean, in the time that I reported on those issues in those 4 years, abortion was decriminalised in 4 states. And I think that those rights are really important and those rights should be protected. But what I would love to see is an expansion of how we think about reproductive rights to not just be about the decision of not have a kid or not continue a pregnancy or contraception, but also to think about if you do want a kid, to have the support to do that. And I mean that like medically, but also beyond that. Like reproductive health care should also be like about housing policy and about domestic violence legislation and all these things that incorporate and weigh into the decision of whether or not someone can continue a pregnancy, because those came up in every interview I did with people about their terminations and stuff. There was so many factors involved that was so far beyond their personal life.
Yep. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah. Gina, it's been an enlightening chat. Thank you. What a pleasure it's been to speak with you. Your book is the most important job in the world. I agree with you. I think it is that, along with what happens after we have kids and we send them off to school, and our teachers probably, important as well. That's a whole nother topic. Yeah. But thank you so much for your time and good luck. I hope this book flies off the shelves and people read it.
It's been so wonderful to chat.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective. It's just amazing. It's wonderful.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Gina.
She's a busy woman. She's off to her next publicity podcast interview,
I'm sure,
pushing her book.
Doing the book tour.
The most important job in the world. What did you think?
Well, it's a perspective that I don't think has ever had a light shone on it before. I feel like anyway, like I can't think of, it's been mentioned, but I don't think there's ever been a deep exploration of that consideration of what if I don't want to have a baby, or what if I do, and what are all the reasons that I do want to have one, and why am I making those choices to not or to have? And I think that's I feel like it's a really important topic to consider. I mean, it's something, because for me, as you know, I've said this for a million years, that from the age of 5, I knew I wanted children. So it was very clear cut for me. Yeah. My elder sister never wanted to have children. Very clear cut for her. Though, what went into making those decisions for both of us, and what goes into decision making for women and men too, about why or why don't I feel like having a baby, and that it's sort of the beginning of like conscious parenting in a way.
I absolutely couldn't have put it better, actually. I loved this chat. I loved hearing the perspective of Gina, more so of her generation, because they've got a whole different perspective, and it fills me with great positivity, actually. And I'm so glad to hear Gina say she has hope, because it just takes action. If we just take action, be kind, all those things, If you've liked the conversation today, please put a little like, put a little tick, especially on Apple podcast platforms. They love that, and we do too. So we'd be most grateful if you did. And we'll catch up with you on Separate Bathrooms next time.
See you later.